Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lauren Speranza, Director of SIPA's Transatlantic Defense and Security Program. And today I have the enormous pleasure of sitting down with retired Admiral Jamie Foggo, former commander of U.S. Naval Forces Europe and Africa and Allied Joint Force Command Naples, who's also a distinguished fellow with SIPA. And we're here to talk about a very interesting region for the U.S. and its European allies and partners, the Arctic. Now, the Arctic has been catching some headlines these days, despite some neglect, I would argue, over the past few years. And really, this is as a result of climate change. Receding ice has been opening new opportunities, including previously inaccessible resources like oil and gas and new shipping routes, too. And this is drawing a whole bunch of new economic and military activities, not only from regional nations, but also third parties like China. And with the spike in all of this activity and in players, tensions are forming and the risk is rising for potential miscalculations or mistakes. And against this backdrop, U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken is on a visit to the region this week, including stops in Denmark and Iceland. And his trip is capped off with a ministerial meeting at the Arctic Council, the primary governance forum for the region, which just recently concluded. So Admiral Foggo, you have done a lot of thinking about the region based on your experience there and have written a terrific piece for SIPA that has just been released. So I encourage everyone to check that out. And you and your co-author, Lieutenant Commander Rachael Gosnell, offer some new ideas for ways to navigate the evolving dynamics in the Arctic before tensions flare further. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on both the Secretary's visit and how that relates to some of the themes in your piece. So thank you so much for being here. And I thought it would be helpful if maybe you could just start by quickly setting the scene for us, with what Secretary Blinken was walking into with this visit. I mean, what's the latest that's happening on the ground right now in the Arctic, and why does it matter?
Lauren, thanks very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here as one of the fellows from the Center for European Policy Analysis to talk about a passionate subject for me, and that is the polar region, the Arctic. I'm a submariner. I've been up there a couple of times. I've commanded up there during my time at Naval Forces Europe with Exercise Trident Juncture. And I've noticed a lot of change since my first deployment to the North Pole in 1985. First of all, climate change is real, and the Earth is warming up, and the Arctic is getting hot. That's no pun intended. The ice is melting. It's creating more sea space. And where there is more space, there are commercial interests. So there's a lot more traffic going across the top of the pole than there was back in '85 when I was first up there on USS Sea Devil. So that's created a little bit of a problem with crowding and the potential for any kind of a commercial accident. Think along the lines of Exxon Valdez, or what would happen if we had a cruise ship get in trouble up there, hitting an iceberg running aground. Additionally, there's a lot of military traffic up there. Some, associated with the Arctic Council of 8 Nations would like to say that we don't want to militarize the Arctic. But I have to tell you, the Arctic has been militarized for a long time. We've fought wars up there in World War II, convoys to Murmansk, the Germans fighting from the high north against the Allies during the Second World War. And so it is very much a region that has become militarized. And with the additional commercial and military traffic, it's likely to become even more militarized. And so I remain concerned. And I think there's a necessity for dialogue. Secretary of State Tony Blinken met with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Iceland, an Arctic nation, the former chair of the Arctic Council, for 2 hours of talks on the 19th, then attended the Arctic Council meeting on the 20th. I think it was very productive. I think there's an agenda formulating both for the summit with President Biden and the future of the Arctic Council. And there's a few things that I think we are articulating and advocating for in SIPA that might help as this process moves forward. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Admiral. It's really helpful to get your take on what's going on. And I want to come back to Russia. You mentioned, of course, one of the biggest players up there. And the broader tension in the U.S.-Russia relationship is running high right now in the wake of a whole bunch of things. Russian hacks against the U.S., sanctions on Russia from the U.S. side, the Navalny poisoning, a ton of things. And some, because of what you mentioned about the Arctic being an area for cooperation. And I think this meeting some thought that this meeting would pave the way for more of an opening, for a more constructive tone between the US and Russia and this potential summit that you mentioned that the Biden administration has talked about. And we saw, in the margins of the meeting, Secretary Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov did a joint press conference that sort of struck a rare constructive note. But there were also, tensions about Russia critiquing some of NATO's military activity in the broader High North. And so I think this tension, between the need for dialogue and deterrence is really interesting. How are you seeing this play out? And does what's happening in the Arctic, and as you mentioned, Russia just taking over the chair of the Arctic Council, does this actually bring prospects to defrost the US relationship with Russia?
Well, Lauren, I like to think so. And I consider myself a glass half full kind of person. And that's the way I've conducted, business all of my life. But I'm not naive. These things that you mentioned, the Russia hackathon against the United States, ransomware, which is nefarious criminal elements acting from within Russia, and Russia has a responsibility to shut that down, and the plight of Alexei Navalny. These things are all totally unsatisfactory. And we respond with sanctions, and then both countries end up ejecting diplomats, which leaves less opportunity for dialogue. I'm a big believer in dialogue. I used to host the Ink Sea agreement talks between Russia and the United States in Naples, Italy. And I was pleased to see the Secretary of State sit down with the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Russia and have a dialogue for a couple hours on the 19th, and again in the Russian context of the Arctic Council on the 20th. Russia is now the chair of the Arctic Council. Iceland turned over to Russia. I see that as an opportunity, not a liability. And I think we need to continue this dialogue for the foreseeable future so that we can come to some kind of a compromise on security, stability, and peace in the Arctic. One of the things I remain concerned about as far as the militarization of the Arctic is there's a lot of new weapons out there. President Putin has announced a couple himself: hypersonics, the Sikran missile, the Poseidon, very fast long-range torpedo. Where's that going to be tested? Is the Arctic going to become a battle laboratory and a proving ground for those new weapons? And how are we going to regulate that and keep it safe? There's a new player on the block, and that is China. China likes to refer to itself as a near Arctic nation, and Xi Jinping talks about the Polar Silk Road. Well, China is not an Arctic nation like those 8 Arctic nations that make up the Arctic Council. And so we have to establish some swim rules and swim lanes and ground rules with regards to other nations outside of the 8. Back to you.
Well, that's a perfect segue into where I was heading, because I think some of the ideas you offer in your piece for SIPA are really geared towards this question of how do we handle new players like China in the Arctic? And you suggest the possibility of a new kind of model for strengthening Arctic peace and stability and security. Can you explain to us what that looks like in your view? You have termed this idea that the TransPolar Bridge. So explain to us what you mean by that and the different components.
Well, thank you very much. And, it's not just my idea. I've worked for many years with Commander Rachael Gosnell, who's a very professional naval officer who was part of my Commander's Action Group in Naples. We've stayed in touch, and Rachel's pursuing her PhD in Arctic Studies. She's a brilliant scholar. So kicking ideas around before I departed Europe and to this present day, we were looking for opportunities to try to stimulate dialogue, discussion, stability, security, and peace in the Arctic. And if you think about the model for the last 72 years, that model is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. From the Washington Treaty in 1949 until present day, NATO has maintained a peaceful environment and deterrence over the course of these 72 years. We haven't gone to war. We haven't gone to nuclear war. That is commendable. So what's the recipe for success? What's the mechanism? What's the secret sauce? So we asked ourselves those questions. And if you think about that, there's a charter, there is a council, a North Atlantic Council, and regardless of what anybody says, NATO operates on consensus. And so everybody gets a vote, and those votes are considered equal, regardless of how large or how small the country in the chamber of the North Atlantic Council. And then there is a military committee. So the North Atlantic Council will decide policy and strategy, and the military committee will assist with implementing that strategy at the tactical level and work with Allied command operations at SHAPE in order to do so. Is there a model like that for the Arctic? Well, I submit that there is. We have an Arctic Council of 8 Arctic nations which is a smaller microcosm of the NAC in Brussels and NATO. We also have an Arctic Chods Conference. The sad thing is that conference has not met with the military Chods since the illegal annexation of the Ukraine. Now that Russia is sitting in the chair, perhaps it's time to get back to the table as chiefs of defense of those 8 Arctic nations. There are others out there who could be accorded an observer status, but that then would depend on their behavior and their adherence to norms and standards and institutions on the maritime domain internationally around the globe. So good behavior could beget an invitation to the table of the legitimate 8 Arctic nations that met in Reykjavik today.
It's a really interesting idea, and I love the parallels that you drew to the transatlantic bridge. I think it's also worth underscoring, that this fits with existing governance models, as you said, the Arctic Chods Conference, the Arctic Council itself. And so I think it would be helpful to hear from you. I mean, this clearly it builds on what the Arctic Council is already doing, but it goes beyond that to add more of a military dimension, given everything that's happening. And for many of the allies that you mentioned, allies and partners earlier, that, are hesitant to kind of militarize the Arctic further, or who say the Arctic Council works, we're going to stick with this format. How would you respond to them? Why is this needed now? Why do we have to go beyond this with this new type of platform?
Well, again, Lauren, I think if you look at the transatlantic bridge and its success over 72 years, it's more than just a military alliance in NATO. It's a military alliance that is subordinate to civilian authority and consensus across what is now 30 nations. Now, that's absolutely amazing that NATO can move forward with policy and strategic directions that have been approved by 30 nations. That's what makes it so successful. So why not use the same model in the Arctic, and let's get the dialogue going in terms of the TransPolar Bridge. So we've heard from the Chinese about the Polar Silk Road. We know that the NATO model is successful. The transatlantic bridge has been successful. Why not a TransPolar Bridge with an Arctic Council and an Arctic Chods Conference that, decides on policy at the civilian level that's agreed to by the 8 Arctic nations, and then the enforcement of those policies and fair practices and norms and standards and institutions can be agreed to by the respective militaries and the Coast Guards. And the Coast Guards have been very successful at this and have continued their meetings past 2014. I think it's now time for the military chiefs to come together, because there's a lot of military hardware up there, and there is a risk of mistakes or miscalculations. We don't really have a methodology for communicating broadly across all of those Arctic nations. The United States and Russia has the Instance at Sea Agreement, and we have rules and standards of behavior on the high seas, but some of the other nations do not, and they do not have the same kind of ability or schema for communication with the PLA Navy. So one of the items that could be on the agenda for the Arctic Council in the context of the Arctic Chods could be a methodology for communication, like CUES, the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea. That started in the Western Pacific, and it's been pretty successful. And perhaps more signatories and perhaps the Arctic nations would like to sign on to that so that they can themselves be able to communicate safely and successfully when they come across a warship or a commercial ship of another nation.
Thank you for that. Really helpful. And I think there is clearly momentum for both U.S. engagement in the region, and just looking at all of the announcements coming out of the most recent Arctic Council ministerial. We did see the adoption of the first ever strategic plan for the Council's work for the next 10 years. And so I think there is this growing momentum to do more, and there is attention growing towards the region. But I would be curious, short of establishing the TransPolar Bridge, I mean, how would you rate the kind of success of the most recent ministerial? Do you think the Biden administration made the most of the opportunity? And maybe do you have any next steps you'd like to see going forward, perhaps towards the establishment of a TransPolar Bridge?
Absolutely. I think the Biden administration deserves high marks and a lot of credit for what transpired during the Arctic Council meeting today. And as we move forward, what I would like to see in the future is, at the very end of the summary of that meeting, there was a reference to the future meetings of the Arctic Coast Guards. As I said, I would like to see the Arctic Tribes Conference come back and actually be a productive forum for meeting of all of the 8 nations CHODs, and then the council can decide if they want to bring anybody else in. Other nations that declare themselves as near Arctic nations because they have commercial interests and because they're going to be transiting the pole. I mean, a lot of this water is apportioned under territorial rules of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea and economic zones to those nations that are legitimate Arctic nations. But there are global commons up there, and everybody has the right to innocent passage or transit passage. So I'd like to see some regulation there. There's a big debate between the United States and Russia now on the Northern Sea Route and whether or not we should be subject to the rules that Russia has put on the table. And I think there needs to be dialogue there so that we can, come to some kind of an agreement on the future should we ever need that transit route for our purposes or anybody else's purposes. So there's a lot that can be done. I am encouraged by the dialogue to date. I'd like to see more in the future, and I'd like to see this done under the umbrella in the context of civilian leadership and those folks that are in the military serving every day in the maritime domain around the world. We'd be happy to help and do whatever we can to maintain peace and security and stability, just like we've done for 72 years in NATO.
Fantastic. Well, lots to do. Some great food for thought there. Admiral Foggo, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about what's happening and to throw some new ideas out there for what we might do going forward. So I encourage everyone to check out Admiral Foggo's piece on building a TransPolar Bridge. And we look forward to continuing the discussion on these really important issues in a critical region for the transatlantic community and our allies and partners. So thank you so much, Admiral Foggo. Great to see you as always, and we'll see everyone again soon.